Hi guys, and welcome to another podcast from me, myself and mind. Myself, Dominic, and we have here Dan Edwards. And today we have a fantastic guest. His name is Professor Paul Gilbert. Not only does he have a PhD to his name, but he has been awarded an OBE for his contribution and his work for well over 40 years into mental health care. He's authored and edited 21 books and also researched well over 200 academic papers, primarily focusing on compassion. And that's what the podcast is about today, looking at the evolution of the human brain and how we all need compassion in our daily lives and how we should actually apply that to make our lives and other people's lives around us far better. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy the podcast today.
Hi, Paul. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast, and we're going to be discussing, the topic of compassion, something that you're, very familiar with. But before we go into that, we'd just like to start by asking, how have you been over the last few months, and how's everything going with you? Is the situation affecting you, and how are your courses going online? And just tell us a little bit more.
Well, I think we've all been taken aback, haven't we, by this virus, because we really, in our lifetimes, let's hope never again, we haven't really ever experienced anything like this. Mm-hmm. And it reminds us really the importance of compassion, actually, because we live in a very fragile world. We forget that we can be hit by illnesses and diseases just like that. We're quite lucky in the West because our medicine is pretty good, but every so often, we just get reminded that life is quite fragile, and it's very easy for us to fall into these rather, traumatic and tragic experiences where, this virus is a killer. So for me, we were in Australia, right? I was supposed to do a tour of New Zealand, and then all of a sudden everything closed down, and then we were in the hotel, and the hotel people said, "Oh, I don't think you're going to get back because they're closing all the airports." And what? So we kind of dashed off. We just managed to get back at the end of March, and then we went into lockdown, so we didn't get to see our grandkids and all that sort of stuff. So that was a bit sad. And my wife had quite a severe back problem, which couldn't get treated, so that was a problem. So there's been, like other people, there's been a number of things which have really been rather unpleasant and sad, really. But gradually, we're obviously coming out of it, and we're getting used to dealing with face masks and social distancing and, or as we say, safe relating. We'd prefer to use that term. So yeah, we're just coming to terms that we're just a little bit worried about, subsequent lockdowns. We did a whole series of talks, which are on YouTube. If you want, I can send them to you, on compassion coping with COVID. Because I think, it has had, we know that anxiety and depressions and domestic violence, whole kind of stuff has gone up, which is very sad and tragic. So it's been very hard for people. But we're relatively well off. We haven't lost our jobs or anything like that, so we've done well, really.
And I'm sure everybody's had. It's been affecting everybody in
yeah, it's tragic. It's tragic.
Yeah, it's very challenging, isn't it? It's as you say, a lot of courses have gone online, and there's been a bit of a disconnect with families and people across the world, which is a shame.
Yeah. And for the students, it's a tragedy because, at that age, what you want to do, go to university, go to parties, have a good time. It's the one time in your life when you get to do that, really, isn't it? Before you get, and of course, all that's been taken from them. People's weddings have been cancelled, operations have been cancelled. It's not just the virus itself, but the knock-on effects of lockdown have been horrendous, really.
I think you're right there, Paul. The mental health is so poor. I think it was sort of on the floor before this crisis. I think it's below the floor now. And I was going to lead into to talk about your book, which is absolutely fantastic, The Compassionate Mind, and how you've so well detailed how the human brain has evolved over thousands of years, and how the question really is, how does this link into those three systems that you talk so well about in your book? How does this involvement link into those three systems?
Okay, so the key thing is understanding the system. So first of all, we have to start off with understanding what are the challenges of life. All living things have three major challenges. Firstly, to be able to defend yourself from threats and harms and injury, so don't get caught by predators and all that stuff. Try and avoid diseases if you can. So we have a kind of a disgust, don't we? We see something a bit rotten or something like that. We don't eat the food. So we have a whole series of motives, emotions, which help us to deal with threats. How we deal with threats. So is one of those emotions will be anger. We can fight back at a threat. Another would be anxiety. We can run away. So that is the first challenge of life. And that is actually your most dominant system. More processing power is given to assessing and dealing with threats and having to deal with them quickly than any other system. So that's really quite important. Because people often have a lot of issues with anxiety and anger that they don't particularly want, but the problem is that we have a brain that's been evolving over millions of years, so we have a very, very sensitive threat system because it saved our ancestors, right? But unfortunately, it doesn't do us a lot of good, or sometimes it doesn't do us a lot of good. So then the next challenge is to go out and achieve things, do things, find enough food to eat, build your shelters, find individuals to mate with, and so on. We call those drive. That's drive. And there are drive emotions that help you with that life challenge, the challenge to get on in life and get resources to flourish. That's important. And these are emotions such as excitement and pleasure and joy and so on. And that's extremely important. So, for example, if you win the lottery and you suddenly get a lot of resources, you become worth 10 million or 20 million. The chances are you will have a big buzz of what we call dopamine. You'll become very excited, slightly hypomanic. You won't be able to sleep because your mind will be racing. So we're biologically set up that when we get resources, we get these positive feelings. When we lose resources, if on the other hand, somebody steals 10 million from you, you have a very different. So resources, then the emotions of a resource are very important. And then the third system, as you say, is that when we're not having to deal with threats, running away or fighting, whatever it is, or striving to make things happen, find food or whatever, then the body needs to go into rest and digest, because you can't stay activated all the time, because then you just burn out, all your organs would collapse and so forth. So there has to be opportunities for resting and digesting. And these are linked to emotions such as feeling a sense of peacefulness, contentment, and so forth. And what's quite important is that these emotions have rather kind of lost their importance in Western society. We don't really focus so much now on cultivating the emotions of resting and digesting, learning how to be content, learning to be at peace, learning how to be in the present moment, learning to take the simple joys of the pleasures of the taste of food, the smell of the air, the beauty of the night sky, whatever. Yeah. So part of what we do in CFT is try and balance up these emotions. So threat's important, but you don't want it too much. Drive is important, but you can be overdriven. In our society, we're grossly overdriven. We're very competitive. We want more and more and more and more. But actually, what we also need to learn is how to use the third system, which is to be just a little bit slow down, feel a little bit more content with where we are, appreciate our relationships more, and take enjoyment for the small things.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, sorry, Paul, for the benefit of our listeners, what is CFT again? Could you just?
Oh, that stands for compassion focused therapy. So what that means is that we call it compassion focused, underline focused, because what it means is that we develop compassion in many different types of therapeutic intervention. There are many different things we can do therapeutically, but it's important that the client experiences them with what we call compassion motivation. I mean, I can talk a little bit about that if you want to, but it's how do you focus the therapy, but with a compassion motivation.
Fantastic. And I noticed that you said earlier that we are highly attuned to the threat awareness system.
Yeah.
And how are we so and the 21st century and the fast paced and the I need more and I need more, how is that keeping us there? And how will that play out with our mental health if we stay there?
Well, it's a great question, Dan, because we know that over the last 20, 30 years, competitiveness has increased quite dramatically, particularly in younger cohorts, that we are much more sensitive to the social media, social comparison, other people doing better than us. A lot of our schools now, they have league tables and this issue of compete. there's some very interesting data showing that people are becoming a little bit more perfectionistic. They're having higher expectations of what they expect the world to give them, and also what they themselves should be able to achieve and do. And so we're creating a world where we have these ideals, and if we can't get these ideals, then we end up feeling disappointed, and we either attack other people or we attack ourselves, right? We find it increasingly difficult to deal with disappointment and frustration, and that is a little bit of a problem. So there's a great increasing sense of competitive entitlement, but also we know that increasing levels of depression and anxiety are partly, particularly in younger cults, associated with a sense of self-criticism, feelings of being failure, not being as good as other people, not getting on in the world as they wanted to get on, and so on. So the competitive psychology, as opposed to the compassionate psychology, competitive psychology in the West is really driving us into quite a lot of mental health problems and insecurities.
Uh-huh. And how does that affect the brain? You know, what systems in the brain are being activated when we're trying to be too competitive, when we are in that anxious or depressed state of mind?
Well, it's, I mean, you know, when you're being competitive, it can be partly drive, that can be partly the system, that's dopamine and the sympathetic nervous system and other processes like that. And of course, the point is, it's always the threat of failure, which causes a lot of stress. So we did a lot of research on what we called competing to avoid inferiority. In other words, we know that some people are very competitive, but why? What are they competing for, right? Now, for sure, some people are competing to get richer and so forth, but our data shows that a lot of people are competing because they're worried if they don't keep up, they'll be left behind. So they'll answer questions like, you know, if you fail, nobody's interested in you. Who's interested in a loser? Unless you keep running, you'll always fall behind. So people have those kind of beliefs. I've got to keep going. I've got to keep, you know, challenging myself and improving and so on. Otherwise, I should get left behind. So there's a lot of fear of failing the rat race, if you like, which drives a lot of depression and anxiety in people.
Yeah. I suppose this, you know, this orientation to become first all the time. I mean, I saw a T-shirt once that said, "Second is first place loser," you know, and that's even more pressure, isn't it? And it's like you said, through the league tables. It's. I think in the book you spoke about the NHS. They have targets. You know, the schools have targets. Everywhere has a target, but you know, we're emotional and spiritual human beings, aren't we? We're not just mechanical. I think that's part of the issue. Would you say, Paul?
Very much so. It's a great point you make there, Dominic. Yeah, and targets distort the system. I mean, certainly I worked in the NHS for 40 years, and targets look like they're a good thing, but actually they distort the system, because then people become very worried if they're not meeting their targets. What are the consequences of that? So they start slightly bending the rules and so on. I mean, you know all the stories, for example, about having to have a bed in accident and emergency. So what they did is they turned trolleys into beds. Come on. All that kind of stuff goes on. So targets are not necessarily good things. What you actually need is what is called a lean system, which John Seddon talked a lot about, which is that you make sure that people have the resources to do the job. That's the key thing. You don't have a top down, let's make you get targets, because people will try and get those targets fairly or unfairly. What you need to do is to make sure that people are properly trained and properly resourced. And if you do that, they will naturally meet your targets, right? But if you try and starve them of resources and then make them meet targets, which is what goes on in the NHS, then you get into trouble.
Fantastic. Great answer. So I suppose the other side of, the sort of the lighter side, should we say, of human nature is all about the soothing and the contentment system. Could you talk us through that system a little bit more, and how do we find that within us? I mean, this links into question 5 as well, so what is compassion? That drills back to that. So how do you feel, Paul, that we can access this soothing contentment system?
Okay, well, I wonder if it's okay with you if I take the second part first. So when we think about what is compassion, this is really quite important, because there's a lot of stuff on the internet, compassion is about love or kindness or whatever. Forget about that. These are ways of being compassionate, but it's not compassion itself. Now, if you think about the origins of compassion is basically in caring behavior, particularly between parent and child. Now, interestingly enough, there are even fish, father fish, that actually guard the nest and fan the nest with their fins and so forth. They look after their offspring, even fish, right? So caring behavior, the concern with the well-being and the development of another, in this case your offspring, that's millions and millions and millions of years old, and that has been evolving through birds do it, obviously, but mammals do it, and humans do it amazingly well. So what is that then? What is the key element of compassion? Well, firstly, it's the ability to pay attention to another, be sensitive to the needs or the suffering of another. That's the first thing, you gotta be sensitive. And then the second aspect of it is that you're motivated to try to do something about it, to alleviate, to fulfill the need or alleviate the suffering, and ideally prevent it in the future. So that gives you a nice definition. The compassion is when we are emotionally sensitive, we're sensitive to suffering, we don't turn off from it, we don't deny it, we don't dissociate from it, oh, I can't be bothered with that. We're sensitive to it, we engage with it, and also then we try to work out what to do. Now, that's great, except the next point is that that means that if you're going to engage with suffering, there needs to be a certain degree of courage, a certain ability to tolerate what you're going to engage with, isn't it, really? You can't just turn up and if you haven't got the courage to tolerate, and you need a certain degree of wisdom. And this is important because it means that compassion is not one thing. There are many, many different types of compassion, right? Compassion is very dependent on context. For example, a firefighter who's about to risk their lives going in to save a family, or a medical person on a COVID ward who risks getting it themselves, the only thing you can say about that, that is courageous. That's courageous behavior, okay? But equally, they need wisdom. Because if I rushed into a burning house or onto a COVID ward, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing. I mean, I might want to save somebody, but I don't know what I'm doing. So you also need the wisdoms and the skills to be able to do what you want to do, right? So in the case of a firefighter, they want to have the strength, so they'd obviously have to work in the gym from time to time. They need to keep up on their skills, but they also have to be able to regulate their anxiety. So that means that in that case of compassion, you're not in a calm mind and a soothing mind, you're in a dedicated mind, a grounded mind, and a mind that will allow you to do what you want to do, right? Without being distracted by anxieties or waking up one day and saying, no, I can't do that anymore. So this is very, very important. Firstly, then, compassion is sensitivity to suffering with a commitment to do something about it. But that really depends on what it is. If you're a counselor counseling bereaved people, then clearly you don't need the courage or the skills of a firefighter. And clearly, people who will lay down their lives to save you don't necessarily make the best counselors or even the best parents. You can be a wonderful, compassionate parent, but you might not make a very good firefighter or even a good counselor. So it's very important to understand then that compassion is this sensitivity, but what you're sensitive to and in what context depends on what you actually need to learn. Now, when it comes to ourselves, therefore, it's the same issue. We can be compassionate when we have a headache or we feel pain. It becomes a little bit more tricky to be compassionate to things about ourselves that we don't like. For example, can we be compassionate to anxiety when we actually don't like being anxious? Can we be compassionate to our dark side? So compassion then is the courage to engage with both physical risk, but also mental pain. And in psychotherapy, that's partly what we're doing, is building the courage and the wisdom for people to be able to engage in the source of their mental suffering. So in the case of, say, somebody who's working with trauma memory, we help them build the courage to begin to revisit that memory and work with that memory. In the case of, say, someone who's agoraphobic, we help them build the courage to go out. Now, so the next question is, that's very interesting. So how do you build courage? Now the soothing system becomes very interesting, because now we use stimuli that is going to balance us. It won't necessarily put us into soothing, but it will activate the system to balance the other two. So imagine then an agoraphobic client who has to go out, and they're panicked, they don't want to go out because they're frightened to go out. Yeah. But what you do is you make sure that when they go out, they tune into what we call the compassionate self. And this is a self that will speak to them, your own inner voice, will be trained to be kind and supportive and friendly. So we work with people, teach them voice, tone to your thoughts, imagining thoughts. And secondly, will be a source of encouragement. So when the person is going out, they'll have this voice in their head that says, look, you know, all this agoraphobia, it's not your fault, but you're doing great. Just take a step at a time. So here you go. Remember your breathing. Because what you don't want is the person to going out and thinking, I'm going to panic. This is terrible. It's a waste of time. What's the matter with me? Nobody else is agoraphobic. It's just me. All of that chatter will undermine courage, but support, engagement, and friendliness. That is what creates courage. That's what creates courage. So, and also you can think to yourself, look, if you've got something awful to do, like you have to have a major operation or something, having people around you that are supportive and helpful and say, okay, I'll come with you to the hospital, that gives you courage. Mm-hmm. Having people around you say, well, you just have to get yourself there. I can't be bothered with you, sorry. Or pull yourself together, stop, be a man, get on with it. That does not support courage. That supports, we know what men often think is courage actually is a form of dissociation. They're just cutting off from they're not actually engaging. So, you know, those are a few preliminary thoughts, really.
So how do we engage with that dark side? You know, because we've all got one, haven't we? You know, and that side of us that negative chatter's going on. How do we begin to engage in that?
Well, it's a great question, Dan, because the first thing is acknowledging that you have and don't take flight with it. Look, one of the things we always say to our clients, well, everybody really, is that all of us have just found ourselves here, right? So if you're working with a group, you can say to your group of clients, group of patients, how many of you chose to have 2 legs and 2 arms? Put your hands up. How many of you chose to have a head with a brain that's got the potential for anger and anxiety? Put your hands up. How many chose to be a male or a female? How many of you chose the parents you were born into? Oh, right. You didn't choose anything, did you really? So we have brains that have been built for us, not by us. And our job is to work out how the damn things work, because they're full of stuff that evolution has shoved in there to help us survive in the jungles, right? And again, it's full of angers and rages and depressions. We never chose any of this stuff, right? It's all in here. These programs are all in there. We can identify them. If you over-identify with them, however, if you think this is something about me, I'm anxious, or as opposed to this is a program running in my mind, if you over-identify with it, you get stuck in it and you get lost in it, and that becomes a problem. But if you can see to yourself, hang on a minute, I never designed a mind like this. I didn't choose to have a mind like this, okay? So it's giving me panic attacks or whatever it is. What I can do, however, is to work out how they work and what will be helpful to me. Is there a part of my mind I can use that will be helpful when I'm having an anxious thing? I didn't choose a mind that would be very self-critical. Okay, it looks like I'm doing it to myself, but not really, because I just experience self-criticism. You know, I don't choose it. I don't wake up in the morning and think, you know what, I think I'll be self-critical today. Yesterday I wasn't, but today, what the hell, I think I will, you know. It doesn't work like that. I mean, the same with anxieties and angers. We don't choose these things. We don't wake up and say, you know what, I think today I'll have a few panic attacks. Life's very boring, you know. I need to have a few, or I'll have a few rages, you know, because otherwise I'm just so boring. I'm going to have a rage today, I think. No, that doesn't happen. What happens is we suddenly find ourselves anxious. We suddenly find ourselves angry. We suddenly find ourselves criticizing ourselves, right? They're just, whoa. Right, so the key thing then is becoming mindful of this stuff, because you didn't put it there. It's all part programming. So you learn how this stuff is working in your mind, not to blame yourself or shame yourself for it, but to actually make a decision about what you want to do about it. So, and we can, as you say, can find some pretty dark stuff in there, some rages or even sadistic fantasies or whatever it is. They've all been put in there, right? Our job as humans are just to be very aware of the dark side and try as best we can not to act it out, because humans are one of the most compassionate species, but we're also one of the most vicious. We're the nastiest species that have ever walked this planet. I mean, if you look at the history of the wars and tortures, the gladiatorial games, the ways we used to kill people, crucifixions and all kinds of horrible things, humans are potentially very nasty. We're a nasty, dangerous lot, actually. So we have to take responsibility for that, because that's partly the way we're built. We didn't choose that. But if we take responsibility for that, we recognize, yes, we have this potential, but we're not going to act on it, then we have a chance, I think. And that's the point of the compassionate mind, The compassionate mind will guide you and help you and support you to work with the dark side, but not to shame it and try and kill it off.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's like, you know, taking out your guts or something. You can't do that, but you can work with it.
Yeah, and when we do start to then, you know, recognize it and work with it, what are the, you know, physiological and the psychological changes that, you know, are happening within the body and within the brain, you know, when we are being more compassionate towards ourselves?
Okay, so that's a great question. So just imagining, let me put this to you another way in terms of examples about how the brain uses its own thoughts and images to stimulate itself. Okay, example, supposing you're very hungry one night and you see this lovely meal. It's just, you know, if you're a meat eater, it might be steak and chips. If you're a vegetarian, a stuffed pepper. And as you watch and see this meal, you think, oh God, that's, oh my, oh. So it starts your mouth watering, your stomach going, doesn't it, right? But supposing that you don't have any money, and so you just fantasize, oh yeah, I can just imagine eating this wonderful stuffed pepper or whatever. Then your imagery stimulates exactly the same pathways in your brain, which in this case is through your hypothalamus. And you get, through your imagery, this saliva coming, then your stomach acid's going. It's the same with our sex, isn't it? You know, if you see something nice or you're with a partner or whatever, that's all very nice. But you could also lay in bed and just fantasize sexual images, and that will do things to your body, right? And, you know, if you're into tantric sex and tantric yoga, they do this, you know, do it for 30 seconds, have a sexual imagery for 30 seconds, then stop it, then notice what's happened in your body, notice where your body, where that imagery is working, notice the connection between what you're thinking, what's going on in your body. These are really important things. Okay, that's a setup. The key point is, what happens if somebody's criticizing you and putting you down, telling you you're no good and blah. This will stimulate your threat system, and it will make you feel anxious and unhappy, possibly angry. It's certainly not going to make you feel loving, sexual, or hungry, is it, really? It's going to stimulate threat systems. But the point is, you can do it yourself. You can stimulate these brain systems yourself through your own self-criticism or remembering people who were critical of you in the past. By getting locked in self-criticism because you get disappointed in yourself, you know, you get disappointed you can't lose weight or whatever it is, so you criticize yourself, you're locking yourself into a threat loop. And the more you lock yourself into a threat loop, the more difficult it is going to actually be to do the very thing you want to do, because you get exhausted and fed up. So how does compassion help? Well, it turns out that if, when you're struggling, people are kind and supportive and understanding of you, and they really show an interest in trying to help you, this stimulates not your threat system, but your soothing system, and to some degree your drive system. When you're upset and somebody says, okay, let's sit down and talk about it, and you can really feel that goes like this, isn't it? You know, if you have to go to a party, you don't know anybody, you're a little bit, you know, and then you see your best friend, completely different. So we know then that we have systems in our brain that are very responsive to the helpfulness, kindness, and compassion of others. But you can do it for yourself. Okay, we've just established that. You can create images, you can create ways of thinking which are rooted in compassion. And when you do that, you will stimulate those compassion systems in your brain. Now, in fact, what we know is that you can stimulate your own vagus nerve, which is part of your autonomic nervous system. You can stimulate your own frontal cortex when you do this work. A lot of research showing that. If you practice compassion imagery, compassionate thinking about yourself, compassion focusing, you will change the way your body and your brain works. It's like a muscle in a way. So this is the key thing, that what you think, where you put your mind, where you put your imagery, where you put your thoughts, how you think about yourself, how you think about others, this is all stimulating these mechanisms in your brain, right? So just try as best you can to become mindful so that you're not driving these circuits that will make you depressed and unhappy.
That's absolutely fantastic, Paul. So for the listeners, what 3 actions or exact tips would you give them to develop this compassion? I know you spoke about it broadly there, but 3 key.
My 3 big first tips is find out what compassion really is. Don't get taken up by all this internet stuff about you have to have love and all that. Forget about all that. I mean, love is great. I'm all in favor of love. No, you know, I can do Trump when it comes to love. Nobody loves like I like love, you know. which is great, isn't it, really? But that isn't what compassion is about. Compassion really is about this agreeing to be sensitive to the troubles or the pains within you or within others around you or even in the world, right? And saying, look, I'm not going to just turn away from these things. I'm going to be sensitive to these things. I'm going to pay attention. I realize I'm struggling with this, or I realize I'm struggling with that. So the first is the courage to engage with what is causing pain. That's the first thing, the courage to engage with what is causing pain. And that isn't an easy thing to do. And that's why to develop that courage, you need to engage pain compassionately. And there are various breathing exercises. If you slow your breathing down to around 5 breaths per minute, that sort of thing, that can help you. So the next thing then is getting that clear. This is developing the courage to engage, and then recognizing that in order for you to deal with that, this might take you some time, right? We need wisdom. We need the wisdom, and the wisdom isn't on the shelf. You know, you might need to take quite a while working out what's going to be helpful to you. Okay, you might try this or try that. This might work, that might not work. I mean, take COVID, for example. When we first started, we didn't really know what to do. You know, we brought people into hospital and everything. We didn't know how to use respirators. Then they discovered if you turn people on their fronts, that is easier. And then if you have these drugs, you know, the dexamethasone, which is a drug that suppresses cortisol, that actually seems to help. These were discoveries. It wasn't on the shelf, you know. So give yourself a chance to learn, you know. Don't expect for you to come up with answers straight away. So those would be the two things I would say. Courage, okay, and there are all kinds of things on our website so that will show you how to build that courage, how to get your soothing system going, learning how to ground yourself, right? Recognizing that to deal with your emotional pains or the pains of others, you may need courage. But then recognize wisdom takes time. It's not always quick. And you might have to do a bit of trial and error.
Yeah, I think that's something that, I mean, I know myself, I've suffered with, and I presume a lot of people do, because we're built up to want it now. But we've got to realise that life and these experiences of suffering and everything,
it's a culmination, isn't it?
Yeah, it's took time to get there, and it's also took time for you to realise. So it's not just going to change overnight, is it?
No, that's right. That's absolutely right. I mean, I think that's a brilliant point you make, Dan, that don't expect it to change overnight. Just and also be playful. You know, one of the key things we say in CFT is learn to be playful, right? So if you find yourself, you've got frustrated and self-attacking, tell yourself a joke.
Yeah.
Look, okay. Loosen, you know, because people get very tight around these things. You know, I've got to be compassionate. No. Loosen up. So the idea of loosening around life, having more playfulness, you know, if you look at kids running around, right, they're joyful. They're just running around, right? How do you bring joyfulness back into your life? You bring joyfulness back by learning how to be playful again, learning to do things that bring you pleasure, learning to take pleasures from the small things, you know, learning to eat mindfully. So you really taste your food, you know, or going for a walk and really paying attention to the pleasures of the smell of the air or the trees, particularly this time of year in the autumn. Yeah. Learning how to focus as opposed to want, or being disappointed and I'm not good enough and I should have done and I ought to do and why didn't I do and all that stuff, right? It's understandable, but it's not helpful. So just noticing, be playful, be friendly with yourself, recognize that we are all in this crap world together. All of us in this ridiculous body that just falls apart at a moment's notice. So we just got to learn how to work the damn thing. That's the trick of it, really.
That's absolutely fantastic, Paul. Been an absolute pleasure having you on this podcast. I'm sure the listeners and viewers, you know, are going to agree the same. On that note, could you we will put it on the details, but what is your website? It's a what is it?
Yeah, so it's www. Compassionate mind, one word, compassionatemind.co.uk. And you'll find a whole lot of talks in compassionate wellbeing, one word, .com, C-O-M, compassionate wellbeing, one word, .com. So there's a whole lot of exercises there as well you can do.
Okay, brilliant. It's been a pleasure and thank you for coming on.
Good. Well, I hope the podcast goes well for you.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you.